Welcome back to Revise and Resubmit, the show where we break down the latest and greatest in academic research. I'm Pavlov.
And I'm Nikita.
Today we're diving deep into a paper from the prestigious Journal of Marketing. And yes, for those keeping score, that's FT50 Journal.
Yeah.
Putting it among the top business publications in the world. We're looking at how those dreaded app crashes impact user engagement.
Yeah, it's a jungle out there in the app world. We're talking nearly 1.7 million apps on the Google Play Store and over 1.5 million in the Apple App Store. With that much competition, companies feel this pressure to push out updates constantly, trying to gain a first mover advantage.
Right.
This iterative development strategy, as it's called, helps them get their product out quickly, gather feedback, and make improvements on the fly.
But here's the thing. This need for speed often comes at a cost. App crashes. It's like trying to build a plane while you're flying it.
Right.
And it happens to the best of them. DoorDash, Spotify, Instagram, you name it.
Oh, yeah.
In fact, the paper cites a survey where a staggering 88% of participants reported experiencing app crashes.
Wow.
And over 90% had the same app crash on them multiple times.
Ouch. That's rough. And as you can imagine, those crashes have consequences, bad reviews, lower ratings, and ultimately fewer downloads in this hyper-competitive app landscape. Visibility is everything, and crashes can really hurt an app's chances of success.
Yeah, that brings us to the central question these researchers wanted to answer. How do these app crashes, these little digital hiccups, actually impact user engagement? Because at the end of the day, engagement is the lifeblood of any successful app, especially when it comes to mobile commerce and ad revenue.
This is where the paper takes a fascinating turn. It doesn't just look at those immediate knee-jerk reactions to a crash. Instead, it examines the long-term effects of crashes on user behavior, trying to fill a real gap in our understanding.
I'm intrigued. So how do they go about studying this? They can't exactly force apps to crash on people, can they?
Well, not exactly, but they did some pretty clever things. First, they developed a unique framework to study app crashes as a specific form of what they call digital interruption. Think about it. You're in the middle of doing something on an app, you've got a goal in mind, and bam, the app crashes. Your task is interrupted and your flow is disrupted.
Okay, I'm following so far. But wouldn't that just make people frustrated and less likely to use the app again? It's like hitting a roadblock on your way to a destination. You might just turn around and go home.
That's a completely logical assumption, but it turns out the story is much more nuanced. The researchers argue that two competing forces are at play when an app crashes.
Okay, lay it on me. What are these competing forces?
On one side, you have the classic Zeigarnik effect, that psychological phenomenon where we're inherently driven to complete unfinished tasks. Think about those times you can't get a song out of your head or that nagging feeling when you start a book but never finish it. Our brains crave closure. In the context of app crashes, this means we're motivated to go back and pick up where we left off, especially if we were close to achieving our goal.
That makes sense. We're driven to go back, but what's pulling us in the other direction?
Well, there's also the undeniable frustration that comes with app crashes. The app failed us. We might perceive the task as more difficult now, and we could even develop a fear of future crashes. These factors can definitely dampen our motivation to re-engage.
So it's like a tug of war between wanting to finish what we started and being annoyed that the app isn't cooperating.
Fascinating. So how did the researchers disentangle these competing forces?
They started with a massive field study analyzing 18 months worth of clickstream data from a shopping aggregator app. Those apps that pull together deals from different websites. Clickstream data, by the way, is like a digital trail of breadcrumbs capturing every click, tap, and scroll a user makes within an app. It's a goldmine for understanding user behavior.
So they're tracking how people are interacting with this app, specifically looking at what happens after a crash. Makes sense. But how do you identify a crash within that mountain of data? Great question. They used a clever method based on app open and app close events. Normally, a browsing session has both, but if the session ends abruptly with a crash, you only see an app open, and if the user returns, the next event is another app open. It's like a digital record scratch indicating that something went wrong.
That's some smart detective work.
Yeah.
So what did they find? Did those crashes send users running for the hills, or were people more forgiving than we might expect?
Well, the findings might surprise you. They discovered that a single app crash, just one, actually increased engagement in the next session.
Wait, really? So crashing actually makes people come back and browse more.
Yeah.
That goes against everything I thought I knew about app design.
Right. It seems counterintuitive, but remember those two forces we talked about, the need for closure and curiosity, seem to be winning out in this scenario. People return to the app wanting to complete their browsing and see what they missed. It's like they're thinking, okay, app, you messed up, but I'm not done yet. Let's try this again.
That makes sense for a one-time crash. But what about those apps that are constantly crashing? Surely that can't be good for engagement. You're absolutely right. The researchers found that frequent crashes have the opposite effect. When an app keeps crashing, people get frustrated and less likely to return. It's like that old saying, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. Users start to see the app as unreliable, and their motivation to engage takes a nosedive.
And it's not just the number of crashes that matters. The study also found that the timing of those crashes plays a crucial role. Crashes concentrated in a short period are particularly damaging.
Right, like all at once.
Yeah, it's like a relationship.
Yeah.
A few little arguments here and there might be manageable.
Right.
But a week of nonstop fighting and you're headed for Splitsville. If an app crashes several times in a row, it's a recipe for user exodus.
Like a car that stalls out.
Exactly. Evenly spaced crashes are less detrimental, but still not ideal.
Makes sense.
And one final interesting point about this field study, the negative impact of both single and cumulative crashes actually decreases as more time passes since the last crash. It seems time heals all wounds, even in the digital world.
Interesting.
The memory of the crash fades, the frustration subsides, and people are more willing to give the app another chance.
So maybe absence does make the heart grow fonder, even when it comes to acts. Okay, so this field study gives us a lot to chew on, but as with any research, it's important to see if these findings hold up in other settings. Do they do anything to validate their results?
Absolutely. To solidify their findings and dig deeper into the why, the researchers conducted 3 online experiments.
Okay.
These experiments allowed them to create a controlled environment where they could manipulate app crashes and observe user behavior instead of a shopping app. They used a gaming app for these experiments, a simple version of the popular 2048 game. By tweaking the code, they could control when and how often the game would crash, allowing them to test their hypotheses in a more rigorous way.
Clever. So they're essentially creating artificial crashes to see how people react. Did they find the same patterns they observed in the real-world data from the shopping app?
The first experiment focused on establishing the causal link between single and multiple crashes and user engagement. They divided participants into 3 groups. One group experienced no crashes, the second group experienced a single crash, and the third group had to endure multiple crashes during the game. They then measured engagement by the number of tile moves participants made.
Okay, so did the experiments confirm what they saw in the field study?
They did. Just like in the real world, they found that a single crash actually led to more engagement. Participants in the one crash condition made significantly more moves than those who didn't experience any crashes that need foreclosure. And curiosity, we talked about, seemed to be kicking in, keeping people glued to the game even after a frustrating interruption.
So even in a completely different setting, a single crash boosted engagement.
Fascinating.
Fascinating. But what about the multi-crash group? Did they throw their phones across the room in frustration?
Pretty much. Just like in the field study, experiencing multiple crashes led to decreased engagement, the multi-crash group made significantly fewer moves compared to both the no-crash and one-crash groups. The frustration was clearly taking its toll, causing them to disengage from the game.
Okay, so experiment 1 really validates their initial findings. The crash effect is real, and it's consistent across different types of apps. But they didn't stop there, did they?
Oh, no, there's more.
No.
In the second experiment, they wanted to go beyond just observing behavior and really understand the psychological mechanisms behind these changes.
So get inside the heads of the players and figure out what's driving their actions. Interesting. How did they approach this?
They replicated the crash manipulation, no crash, single crash, and multiple crashes from the first experiment, but this time they also measured participants' emotional responses after the game, specifically targeting those mediating factors we discussed earlier: need for closure, curiosity, and frustration. After each game, participants rated their level of agreement with statements like, "I felt like continuing to play the game after the first crash," or "I found the crashes frustrating."
Okay, I see where this is going. They're trying to connect the dots between the objective behavior, the number of moves, and the subjective experience, how the players are feeling. Did they find support for their proposed mechanisms?
Absolutely. The results were remarkably clear. A single crash increased engagement through those exact mechanisms, a heightened need for closure, and increased curiosity about the game. They literally wanted to get back in there and see what happened next. And on the flip side, multiple crashes led to decreased engagement driven primarily by frustration and a feeling that the game was unattainable because of all the interruptions. It's important to note that after controlling for these emotional responses, the negative effect of multiple crashes became much weaker, suggesting that these feelings are really at the heart of the crash effect.
So it really is about the interplay of these psychological forces. It's not just about the crashes themselves, but how we perceive and react to them.
Okay, on to experiment 3. What did they discover in their final act?
This is where things get really interesting, because experiment 3 moves beyond just observation and starts to explore potential solutions. So they're moving from understanding the problem to finding ways to fix it. This is the kind of practical advice I'm sure app developers are dying to hear.
Exactly. In this experiment, they focused on the power of post-crash messages. They wanted to see if explaining the reason for a crash could actually improve user engagement even when multiple crashes occurred.
So instead of just leaving users hanging with a generic error message, they tried to provide some context and transparency. That's an interesting approach. How did they do it?
They created 3 different message conditions. One group got a message blaming the crash on your browser error. Another group got a message stating it was an error on our end. And the third group, the control group, received no explanation at all, just the typical crash notification.
Ooh, that's a clever way to test the effect of different explanations, blaming the user versus blaming the app itself. What happened?
The results were pretty surprising. They found that both messages, regardless of who was blamed, actually led to increased engagement compared to the control group participants who received an explanation for the crash, even if it was blamed on their own browser, were more likely to keep playing the game.
Now that is really counterintuitive. You'd think blaming the user for the crash would just make them more frustrated and less likely to continue.
You would think so, right? It seems to go against everything we know about customer service and handling product failures. But remember, app crashes are a different beast. People seem to be more understanding when it comes to technology, perhaps, because they're so used to things going wrong.
So what do you think is going on here? Why did these messages work, even when they blamed the user?
Well, the researchers suggest it might have something to do with a sense of control and perceived competence when you get an explanation. Even if it's not the answer you want to hear, it at least provides some understanding. It signals that the app developers are aware of the issue and are potentially working to fix it.
So it's not about passing the buck, but about acknowledging the problem and showing that you're on top of things. It's like a doctor explaining a diagnosis. Even if it's bad news, at least you know what you're dealing with.
Exactly. It shows that you're not just leaving your users in the dark wondering what went wrong. And in the case of the "our server error" message, it might also create an expectation that a solution is forthcoming.
Interesting. So communicating clearly with users, even about negative events like crashes, can actually be beneficial. It builds trust and keeps them engaged.
Precisely. This research has some big implications for how app developers think about crashes.
Let's talk about those implications. What are the key takeaways from this research for those in the app building trenches? This research really flips the script on how we think about app crashes. It's not just about minimizing them at all costs. It's about understanding their nuances and even leveraging them strategically.
Absolutely. This study really highlights the importance of taking a long-term view of app crashes and their impact on user behavior. A single crash might actually be a good thing, boosting engagement in the short term, but if those crashes become frequent or clustered together, you're going to start losing users faster than you can say bug fix.
So it's a delicate balancing act. Developers need to weigh the benefits of rapid updates against the risks of introducing instability.
Exactly. And the researchers offer some practical advice for developers trying to navigate this tricky terrain. For example, they suggest a targeted release strategy for new features, especially those that might be a bit buggy.
Targeted release. Tell me more about that.
The idea is that instead of releasing a new feature to your entire user base at once, you could initially roll it out to a smaller subset of users who have demonstrated a higher tolerance for crashes.
So you're using a select group as a sort of beta testing pool, minimizing the risk of alienating your entire user base with a crash-prone update.
I like it. It's a great way to get real-world feedback and iron out those kinks before going wide with a new feature. And remember those post-crash messages we talked about? That's another powerful tool developers shouldn't overlook.
Right. Instead of just hitting users with a generic "something went wrong" message, tell them why the darn thing crashed.
Exactly. Explaining the reason for a crash, even if it's something as simple as "we're experiencing temporary server issues," can go a long way in mitigating the negative effects. It shows users that you're aware of the problem, that you're working on a fix, and that you respect their time and frustration.
So targeted release and well-crafted post-crash messages, two key takeaways for developers looking to manage crashes strategically.
Absolutely. This study really underscores the fact that crashes are an inevitable part of the app development process. It's not about preventing them entirely, but about understanding their impact and using that knowledge to create a better user experience.
You know, it's funny, we often talk about user engagement as this purely positive thing, this holy grail that app developers are always chasing. But this research reminds us that even negative events like crashes can play a role in driving engagement, at least in certain contexts.
It's all about understanding those nuances and using them to your advantage. Could strategically managing app crashes, embracing those insights we've discussed today, actually become a competitive advantage in this crowded market? It's a fascinating question.
It really makes you think. What seemed like a purely technical issue actually taps into some deep psychological principles. So the next time you encounter that dreaded spinning wheel of death, don't just sigh and hit the retry button. Think about what we've learned today.
That's right. Think about the frequency of those crashes, how they're distributed over time, and the messages or lack thereof you're receiving from the developers. Maybe, just maybe, that crash is part of a carefully calculated strategy to keep you coming back for more.
Well, folks, that about wraps up our deep dive into the fascinating world of app crashes and user engagement. We hope you found it insightful. If you want to dig deeper into the research yourself, we'll include a link to the full paper in the show notes.
And if you enjoyed this episode of Revise and Resubmit, be sure to subscribe to our channel on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into the latest academic research.